So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for what is the second BsOT session at the virtual BAUS 2020. Now, this session is going to be split into two parts. So the first part of the session, we'll be hearing about what we've learned from COVID-19 and its effects on training and training in urology more specifically. We'll be hearing from speakers about the new roles of virtual urology and e-learning. And we'll also be getting an update from our SAC chair about the impacts on training and the impacts on training in the curriculum as well. Following on from this, we've got some trainee presentations. We'll be hearing from trainees across the country about their experiences of the good and the bad of training and how they can particularly overcome any difficulties in training. In terms of our panel, we've got a very good panel tonight, and I'm very excited to introduce some of our panel. So first of all, there's myself, so Sot Talafari, the current chair of the BAUS section of trainees. We'll also be hearing from Professor Phil Cornford, who is currently our SAC chair on the new curriculum. We'll also be hearing from Mr. Harry Rattan, who is the BAUS educational lead for SPRs, who I'm sure you'll all know from his outstanding work with the FRCS webinars. And then finally, I'm really pleased that Josh Burke has joined us as well, who is currently the president of the Association of Surgeons in Training. So 2020, initially, we were really excited by 2020 as a BAUS section of trainees. We had just run our first national conference. It was very well attended. We've received very, very good feedback, and we were also very pleased to work and collaborate closely with Burst, and we commend them for all of their good work they've done over the years. Now, unfortunately, shortly afterwards, this happened, as I'm sure we're all probably quite bored of hearing about by now. Now, secondary to the coronavirus pandemic, this has been one of the most challenging times in training, certainly in my lifetime, and I know in the lifetime of many of our senior colleagues. We've really been firefighting essentially over the course of the year. We've been firefighting for trainees to be able to sit exams. We've been firefighting for trainees to be deployed back to urology. We've been firefighting to even allow trainees into theatre. So it's been a very, very difficult year for trainees, and I really do empathise with trainees across the country. In terms of some of the issues we've faced, we've had problems with exams, ARCPs. National selection was done in a very hurried process this year, and I understand there was quite a bit of discontent about this. And we've also been facing issues with trainees coming back from redeployment in terms of timings and when it's appropriate for trainees to be redeployed. As BsOT, as an executive committee, we've been working very hard in the background to advocate for trainees where possible. And I'm actually really pleased with ACIT, and I'm really pleased that Josh has created a collaborative group across all of the different subspecialty areas in order to advocate for trainees nationwide. And this has been a really, really useful resource. It's been a difficult year, but there have been some good things to come out of the coronavirus pandemic. Clearly, the use of training online, webinars, and otherwise has been hugely successful, particularly in urology and otherwise across other specialties. And this is something that's certainly here to stay and something that we'll be hearing much more about a bit later on. We managed to raise over £2,000 for the Urology Foundation by doing the BsOT Fund Run for Tough. We received very good feedback, and I was very pleased to see many people getting involved with raising money for a very good cause. We've also collaborated with Students for Urology, which is a new group which helps us infiltrate into medical students and really inspire the next generation of urologists, which is something that's very important, and we're very pleased to do as well. We've now had a new chairman elected, Neil Harvey. Neil Harvey certainly is the right man for the job. I wish him all the best for the future, and he really will take BsOT in a good direction. I hope he can build on all the good work that's been done so far. I'd just like to take a moment to congratulate Harry Rattan on his winning of the Silver Cystoscope Award. This was awarded secondary to some really hard work and some really outstanding work that has been done to create virtual FRCS webinars and also run the virtual FRCS BAUS course, which I know has received extremely good feedback. So congratulations, Harry, and well done. I'd also like to congratulate Nick Campaign. He is a final year trainee who I believe has now got the CCT in the Southwest region. He won the bronze cystoscope for his outstanding work with Urolink over the course of several years, and he's really gone above and beyond the call of duty there. So congratulations, Nick, and well done. So without further ado, we'd like to get started with this now. So I'm going to be handing you over to Harry Rattan, who, as I've said, is the Silver Cystoscope winner, and he's going to be telling us about virtual urology, which has really taken flight since the COVID-19 pandemic. So over to you, Harry, and thank you for joining us.
Sot, thank you for the very generous introduction. Thank you also for the award. I mean, I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the support that I've received from trainees around the country, and it's really humbling to be given such an award. I've never expected it. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I'm hugely grateful. Thank you so much. And I mean, can I just say it's been an absolute pleasure working with you and all the other BsOT members over this really tricky year. Actually, I don't think any of us knew what we were signing up for when we started our jobs back in January, and it's been a real learning experience. And to have all the support from the trainees that I've had has been absolutely overwhelming. So thank you all, and I hope I can continue to work with you for the next couple of years or so. So SOT's very kindly invited me to talk to you about what we've learned over the last 6 to 8 months about new ways of learning. So I'm not going to be talking so much about clinical training because we've got Phil Cornford from the SAC talking much more about that. So I'm just going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes on the kind of change really in the kind of more didactic and skills-based teaching that BAUS have traditionally been involved with for trainees. So as SOT said, I've been the lead for specialist trainee education since January, and I took over from Owen Hughes, who'd done an absolutely fantastic job at really strengthening the learning offering that BAUS had for specialist trainees. And we had some well-established things from BAUS. So we had skills courses, we obviously had teaching and training during conferences, and we had the hugely popular and really excellent revision course that Owen really built up over his tenure of the post. And then, of course, there were lots and lots of local and regional teaching and training days organized within deaneries. And these were really important, not just for the knowledge-based teaching, but also for bringing trainees together, allowing networking, meeting trainers around the region. And all that obviously came to a sharp halt during the early days of the pandemic. And I mean, certainly speaking from trainees in my own region in the East Midlands, that they had a day release program, if you like, every month to go off to regional teaching, as well as to attend all the other courses around the country. And I thought it was a real kind of sharp shock to go from that to pretty much having no formalized teaching. So we really kind of sat down right at the beginning in BAUS. We had, in fact, it was when I was at an endo-urology committee meeting, and Duncan Summerton, who was a BAUS president at the time, kind of summoned me into the presidential chambers and, look, Harry, what are you going to do about it? These guys are not getting any training. And the big question was, could we replicate some of these offerings, some of these traditional teaching models using tech? And those of you that have seen me talk before know I can't possibly do a talk without bringing a Keanu Reeves Matrix GIF into the conversation. So could we change the grim reality into a brilliant Matrix-based training program? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about briefly. So if we think about the components of virtual learning, I kind of think of them as non-interactive components along with more interactive things. Our non-interactive things have been around for ages, haven't they? And we're all used to looking up literature online and even looking at surgical videos. I think EAU, AUA, and BAUS and BJU have all got fabulous video libraries of procedures that we can look at and learn from. There are many archived webinars. If you go to the AUA, they often archive all their teaching courses and have access to it. And there are beginning to be more in the way of podcasts and ebooks and all this kind of stuff. So that's all kind of non-interactive. You sit there, you content consume. It's like urology Netflix, and you sit there and you listen and you try and learn. But it's non-interactive. There's no engagement. There's limited opportunity for discussion and for peer support. So I think these are very, very valuable, but I'm not going to talk about those so much because we're all really familiar with them. What I was more excited by is the use of the fabulous technology that we now have at our disposal to try and simulate some of the more interactive learning that we do. So rather than just kind of watching a webinar, actually attending a lecture, being able to ask questions, get feedback from the speaker there and then. Small group work. So, if you're at a webinar and you want to discuss cases or something, the ability to go into little virtual rooms and discuss them. Journal clubs. So both to discuss things there and then, as well as perhaps to discuss them in a wider community in social media. How about simulation? Is there any way of somehow getting feedback from trainers virtually about how you do with simulation tasks? My colleague and very good friend Darren Smith is very much into thought, he calls them thought experiments. It's kind of simulating an operation virtually without actually doing it. And I mean, some branches of urology lend themselves to that more than others. So endourology, you can do that. You can talk through the operation, talk through complications. And then, of course, for people coming up to the FRCS, it was about trying to offer viva practice and exam preparation. So the non-interactive stuff was happening and we were doing it, but it was the interactive stuff that I wanted to focus on. And SOT alluded to the fact that we set up this kind of virtual learning program over the course of the pandemic, and it took several kind of steps really. And my guiding principles were to, you know, being a tech enthusiast, I know that there's no single tech solution that works for everyone. So you need to kind of have a very firm idea about what technology you're going to use and what you're trying to achieve from it. Number two is quite important, obviously, is know what your audience wants and you know, really do engage them and try and shape it, because all this is new. And I don't go along with the Steve Jobs principle of people don't know what they want until you show them. I think our trainees have a really good idea of what they want and what they find useful, what they don't find useful. And I did, and SOT helped me enormously with this, is trying to understand what it was of all the things that we could offer that trainees would find most valuable. I'm very grateful to SOT and his colleagues actually for helping me with that. And then thirdly is understanding that virtual learning is different. So for example, and I don't know if there are any East of England, East Anglia trainees here, but they were very kind to invite me to chair a teaching day virtually that they did. And it was an all-day Zoom session, and they did it very well. So there were trainee presentations, there were lectures, but I think one thing that became very evident is that it's actually very wearing sitting there and listening to and watching Zoom for the whole day. It's not the same as being in a lecture theatre and listening to speakers live. And there is some research actually. I was speaking to one of my colleagues at Nottingham University who's into cognitive psychological research, and there is definitely some evidence that there's much more rapid cognitive fatigue, if you like, when you're sat in front of your laptop listening. So you cannot replicate a whole didactic days of teaching worth of teaching using Zoom. You will lose the attention. And it's something that we were very conscious of when we ran the BsOT FRCS course a couple of weeks ago, which I'll talk about briefly at the end. And another thing I've nicked from Darren Smith is one of his favorite phrases. I'm sure SOT has heard it as well, which, you know, particularly applies when you're kind of trying to tackle a tricky stone, is if you're going to fail fast. And I think that's very, very true of when you're trying out new technology in teaching, is try and work out what works, what doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, don't try and spend ages trying to make it better, because there's usually something more easy. You're probably just not using the best solution. So those of you thinking about setting up, you know, virtual learning locally or regionally, these are the principles I used. So very briefly, what did we do with our BsOT learning? So we decided what we needed. So we needed some software to actually organize and communicate with trainees. Okay, so a kind of a way of getting people onto the same platform, so everyone knew what was happening, both faculty and trainees, way of kind of interacting, making trainees feel that they were part of a bigger learning community. And I think that's vitally important actually, because we all are, I mean, we've got the benefit in urology of all being really, really close knit and knowing each other and encouraging that networking, even virtually, I think is very, very important. I'll talk about how we did that. Then we all need some basic technology. And, you know, it's again a testament to our kind of tech landscape, if you like. If this had happened 10 years ago, COVID happened 10 years ago, not everyone would have had the wide access that we now do, but everyone's now got technology capable of running all this fabulous software and interacting. And then you need some way of publicizing it, getting people on board. And social media became a key aspect of that. And again, we're slightly ahead of the curve in urology because we've got a very active social media community. So these are what we thought we needed. And essentially we wanted to do it for no money, because there was no funding. There's no funding at all. There's no money. We wanted to do it for free. So there are various ways you can tackle it. So you can go for an all-in-one bespoke solution. And lots of you have used Microsoft Teams in your trust because the NHS has been subsidized for that. And we didn't go for that because the problem is not everyone's in the same organization nationally. And it's very, very hard to put everyone on equal footing with access rights and all that. Or you can use multiple platforms. And actually, if you choose your platforms well, you can look reasonably smart, okay? But if you choose your platforms badly, those of you who are old as me will recognize Colin Baker's incarnation of Doctor Who, and you end up with one of these patchwork messes of an outfit. So we spent a little bit of time looking into the technology. So we ignored Microsoft Teams deliberately. We ignored virtual learning environments for BsOT, but actually, for example, my colleagues in the West Midlands have set up a fabulous VLE for all the surgical specialties in the West Midlands using a highly bespoke version of Moodle, okay, it's a virtual learning environment. And again, it works very, very well if everyone's in the same organization, whether it's a deanery or a trust or whatever, because you can give everyone a login. It's nice and private. It can host content and it can do video conferencing. But we didn't want to do that. We were going national. We were thinking bigger. So we wanted something that was really easy to use, that, you know, the barrier to people getting involved had to be very low. Otherwise, you don't get people involved. So we settled upon two really powerful bits of software, which are both completely free. So we used Slack, which is essentially a kind of a mass collaboration and messaging system. And I have to thank Viru, one of the trainees in London who I spoke to and had been using it for Burst. Viru's been very active in Burst, and this is what Burst use. And I thought, well, Burst is a fabulous organization with hundreds of collaborators internationally. So if it's good enough for Burst, it would be good enough for us. So that's what we chose. And then Zoom, which you're all familiar with for video conferencing, because it just works so well. So the pros of using multiple platforms is flexibility, all the functionality of having individual programs, scalability. So we started with only a few people involved, and, you know, as we speak, we've got hundreds of people involved in the Slack group, as you'll see, and it was free. All this is completely free, no cost to me, no cost to BsOT, okay? Yet. The cons were just having to learn more software platforms, and there are some security concerns about Zoom. I think these have been largely addressed since everyone started using it back in March and April. Okay, so those of you that have been involved in Slack know that it's a really light software solution that runs really well and allows all of us to talk and collaborate. We can organize groups, we can have faculty group, trainee groups, and it's been really good. And the interaction on there, I think, has been excellent. And Zoom has worked very well. I won't labor the point. I'm certainly not trying to sell either of these things. So the things that we found really useful, and I think you should consider if you're thinking about doing this in your region or whatever, is it is really useful to have screen sharing that works slickly and easily and everyone can access it. Whiteboard functionality is useful if you're doing some interactive teaching. You do need to be able to record and archive your talks and webinars and questions and all that. And you need some tool of collecting feedback, because I think feedback's equally important, if not more important, when you're doing new things. You want to make sure that what you're doing is good. So essentially, these were my objectives, you know, back in March, and, you know, my reactions were initially kind of fairly dramatically kind of like, help, what do I do? So the first step is we got the team together using Slack. So we organized our faculty into one channel, all the trainees into another channel. We appointed admins, all very easy. And, you know, we then got on to actually organizing the teaching, and we decided, just to get things off the ground, we'd go for interactive webinars on Zoom and Viva practice on Zoom for the trainees coming up to the exam. And we just initially chose a Google Drive account, but then moved it to a BsOT Microsoft account for uploading all the material that we produced. And we thought it was really important that we offer it for free to all the trainees in the UK. And actually, initially, we offered it free to the international trainees as well. It was really popular. So we started off with the webinars, and we started off, I think the first one was in April, and by July we'd done 15 and the attendance was going up. We managed to promote them and get new people interested via social media. So there was lots of discussion on Twitter. We posted clips on YouTube. We didn't quite extend into Instagram. I've dabbled in Instagram education, and I'll show you something about that in a bit. And you know, we've considered putting them all out as podcasts, which is still in the process of doing. But the whole process is quite quick. So you know, from inception to the first webinar was only a couple of weeks. And, you know, by the time we got to the middle of the summer, we'd got over 300 people involved in the Slack group, and we were on our 15th, 16th webinar. So it was an absolutely brilliant kind of engagement from the trainees and from my colleagues who gave up, you know, usually their evenings to do all this. And, you know, I think everyone felt really positive about it. So we then decided to up the complexity and try and run the BsOT FRCS urology course, which is normally a really intense week-long residential course involving quite a few delegates, loads of faculty, some lectures, state-of-the-art lectures, and then loads and loads of Viva practice. And it was this Viva, we knew how to do the lectures after our experience over the summer, but it was a Viva practice that really stressed us out. And in actual fact, we ended up using the breakout room functionality, which is another reason that we really like Zoom. And Louise Finch and Harry Heald from BsOT are absolutely instrumental in, you know, getting technology to work. And I'm still rather nervously waiting for the full feedback, Louise, but certainly on the ground during the week, it seemed to work really well. So we could not only do webinars, but we could also actually do interactive stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't quite as much fun as the in-person course. We didn't have the opportunity to socialize and go out for course dinner, but I think it was just fabulous that we were able to do it, and that the trainees found it a positive and helpful experience. And you know, now we have a fallback position. If we're not able to meet in person in March, we know that we have the technology that works. So how about social media? Just want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about that. I mean, social media are obviously traditionally used for looking at funny pictures and video clips and all that kind of stuff. But actually, it really is a powerful tool for medical education. Some of you might have come across this thing called FOMED, which is free open access medical education. And it's really useful infographics and that kind of thing posted on the likes of Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. The emergency medicine people are way ahead of us in this respect. They use it a lot, okay? They've even got a conference based on social media education. And it does allow rapid and wide interaction. In endourology, we often have discussions on Twitter, completely, you know, not breaking any confidentiality or anything like that, but discussing tricky surgical situations and tips and tricks and all that. It's a very active community. And it's also a really good way of promoting what you're doing, okay, and building momentum for it. So I want to show an example of some trainees in my region have set up this fabulous thing. It's for not urology, it's for medical trainees. And it's essentially using Twitter and Instagram and podcasts to help people prepare for MRCP. So this was their iTunes podcast. It's on Spotify, and they're at episode 30 something, I think, and they regularly get about 3,000 downloads a week. So that went from 0 to 3,000 in the space of 6 months. That's 3 brilliant trainees in our region doing it in their own time, and in fact they have a little bit of time in their job. But these things can be done. They take no big resource or financial kind of launch pad needed. You can do it with the technology that you've got and bring benefit to huge numbers of trainees. So this is their Instagram feed. They post facts of the week and all this kind of stuff. I think it's a little video. That's their Instagram feed. I hope that's showing up. And, you know, people, the positive reactions are really massive. And, you know, this is the kind of stuff you can do. And this is the kind of stuff that the younger trainees particularly are very familiar with. Okay, not old fogies like me, maybe, but actually even we are getting familiar with it. So fantastic use of technology. So I'm going to finish up in a minute because I know Phil's got a lot of really fabulous stuff to tell you, but there's some things that I learned were, number one is don't try, and you don't need bespoke technology. There's plenty of good stuff out there. Don't reinvent the wheel, okay? because there's no doubt that you'll find something that will suit your needs without spending lots of money. Don't do all day Zoom meetings, please, please, please. You will just get knackered very quickly. And if you do, make sure you build breaks into it. So when we did the FRCS course, we were really strict about having loads of breaks, and actually the vivas were interactive, so it felt a bit less hard work. Don't forget, I believe that as much as possible, it's great to put free educational resources out there. It's just good for everyone. And don't try and, if you know, TPD's watching this, educational leads and their deaneries, don't try and do it all yourself. Get the trainees involved. They know what they want. They are fabulous at producing content and are usually really happy to help and get involved. And, you know, don't take it all on your own shoulder. And, you know, I only have managed to get all this stuff done with BsOT because of all the input that I've had, both from BsOT, from Louise and Harry, as well as from all the fabulous trainees and all my brilliant colleagues that gave up their time. So really, you know, I would like to dedicate my Cystoscope Award to all the people that have been so fabulous in helping and supporting me in this really tricky time, and I'm really happy with what we've achieved. We're not going to rest on our laurels. We've got some great ideas for things coming up next year as well, which you'll be hearing more details about. Watch this space. So my very, very final thought is, don't just think about doing it tomorrow, because you'll never do it. Just get stuck in. And you know, this is one of my favorite things. This was taken from a punk music magazine in 1977, and you know, the whole ethos of making music at the time was you need 3 chords and a slightly beaten up guitar and you can form a band and write a song. And that's what all the bands did in the late 70s. And I would say this is now the era of this DIY kind of idea for medical education in this brave new world that we live in. So you've got the technology, you know how to use it. You've got the trainees that are enthusiastic. Sit with them, work out what they want to do, and go and create something brilliant. I'm absolutely confident that you all can. But I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you ever so much for inviting me to talk SOT, and it's been a real pleasure working with you all. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Harry, for a really nice talk. I really enjoy your talks. You somehow seamlessly managed to go from pictures of Doctor Who to pictures of male models to pictures of Air Jordan to a Keanu Reeves gif, absolutely seamlessly. So so well done on that. So just in terms of questions on that talk, so I suppose this can go to either Harry or Phil. You might want to pass some comment on this. I mean, do you think we're now in a position where deanery-wide teaching will continue to be online, or do you think we'll ever go back to having face-to-face deanery teaching? What are your thoughts on that from either Phil or Harry, really?
I mean, my thoughts are, I feel very strongly that we should try and preserve some form of face-to-face deanery teaching, because as I said at the beginning, you know, I think, you know, what you don't get is that social connection, which is ever so important. And, you know, peer support is perhaps the thing that suffered the most during COVID. And just the fact of, you know, once a month, particularly in a big region like the Southwest, for example, you know, there might only be one trainee in a, you know, distant corner of Cornwall. And the fact that you can get all those trainees together, compare experiences and benchmark yourself and all the rest of it, and just go out for a beer, really, and, you know, support each other. I think that's ever so important. And I'd be really sad to think that that wouldn't happen anymore. What do you think, Phil?
I agree completely. I think that peer support will be important going forward. I do think that you can have some excellent, really well-known speakers if you are prepared to have Zoom type meetings. So it's possible to get people from abroad to speak, to have real experts in subjects that are not in your region. You can have national experts talk, and often if they've only got to do 45 minutes as a presentation, because we can't really cope with these long sessions, but you can just do something in an evening and it's only a short period of time, then people are prepared to give up their time and do that. They've often got that talk in their pocket somewhere, and you can put it online and you can get them to do it, and that makes that accessible right across the country. But that is an adjunct to training rather than to replace it.
Thanks, Phil. Josh, I'm just wondering if you've got any comments, because I know that the ASIT have been quite heavily involved with virtual learning platforms, and I know that you're looking at some at the moment, and there are some other specialties that have been looking at this as well. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on virtual learning platforms. And
Yeah, so we ran our first surgical summit last weekend actually, and all the benefits that have been put forward are entirely true. You know, we managed to pull in speakers internationally, we managed to get delegates from over 50 countries, and there are clear advantages there. But so as you probably know with BsOT, trying to interact with essentially team members and trying to achieve common goals, doing that completely virtually over an extended period, like over coronavirus, is really, really difficult. And going forward, we're having that discussion, you know, planning events in March. Do we go virtual? Do we try and stay in person? Do we offer a hybrid approach, which I think probably is the route which ASIT will head in? I think these are all considerations we're going to have to think of, and I don't think anyone's quite got the answer yet, but my feeling is probably a hybrid approach is the way forward.
Excellent, thanks. Anyone else got any comments, or should we move on to Phil's talk? Okay, so next, I'm very delighted that Professor Phil Cornford has joined us, who is the current chair of the SAC. So he's going to be giving us an update on the curriculum, and we'll be discussing some of the impacts of COVID-19 on future training. So I'll hand over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me to talk. How much changes? I came to Leeds for what was an excellent meeting, and we had no idea whatsoever about what was about to happen to us. We had seen something happen in China, but it didn't really seem as though it was going to make any difference to what happened to us. And now everything's changed, hasn't it? Here we are, even social niceties have changed. And all of this has changed. We wear a face mask everywhere, we're busy being 2 meters apart, and all the pubs are closed, at least they are in Liverpool. So we have got to live in an entirely different world. We've learned lots about what the appropriate PPE is for different situations. Nothing I could have told you about when I went to Leeds, but we've all had to learn something new, and we've had to learn new ways of doing it. We've already heard a lot about how you can do things online. This slide shows all the different forms of webinars that are available on my phone at the current stage. And it's fair to say that only GoToMeetings was available when I met in February. So we've learned lots of new ideas and new ways of doing things. I have to say, I am incredibly impressed by Harry and how much he has done over this. He has really taken the baton and run with it, and for which I am both impressed and very grateful. There was also, during the first peak, a real attempt by the urology section at the RSM to provide training centrally. And because it was funded by the Urology Foundation and a private donor, that was then available free for trainees. And I think those people who logged into that really enjoyed the sessions that came from that. But as we've mentioned already, the big thing that's missing from all of this is peer support. And peer support is so important, particularly if you're the new ST3 starting in August in a single job in a thing. You don't have anybody in your region that you know anymore. And so this is vital, and we will need to find a better way of providing this going forward, particularly if COVID is not going to be the 3 or 4 month problem that we hoped it would be in March and April. These figures were released today at JCST, and you can see here, this is the effect on the number of cases logged in June 2019 versus June 2020. The blue ones being 19 and the red ones being 20. And these are the figures for urology. Now, this isn't per trainee, obviously, but you can see that roughly 50% of the operating cases are being logged by trainees at the moment. So it's changed a lot. And this will have an impact on the training and what people are capable of. These are figures from the ARCP round that have recently taken part between the beginning of June and the end of September this year. And the new thing that shows there, the ringed bit is urology, but that's for all the surgical specialties. About 20% of people in urology had an outcome 10.1 or a 10.2. So those people, we recognise, have got extra work to do going forward. And when 10.1 and 10.2 were first suggested, it was sort of in the hope that there'd only be one peak and we wouldn't have any more trouble. But as we meet online, we're aware that the second wave is absolutely got the country in its grip. This is a statement made at the beginning of October by the College of Surgeons in England, looking at what can be done to try and improve things and mitigate against the way that training opportunities have been limited. They are very keen to see the development of COVID light sites, whether that's in the private sector or on the NHS. And they're looking for increased testing of surgical teams in order to try and protect patients from hospital-acquired infection of COVID. We don't think that the risk of COVID is quite as dramatic as was from the Chinese figures, but there clearly is an increased risk for people who've had a general anaesthetic and who then develop the disease. In addition, there are things we can do but with the schools and the deans in order to try and improve the way that service is delivered. And normalising training in the private sector, perhaps including 24/7 cover, might actually be an important way of maintaining elective work, particularly as that's the bit that in many specialties is what's really missing. If you look at logbooks, often the number of cancer operations that are being recorded haven't decreased a great deal. The amount of emergency surgery is down a little bit, but not immensely. But it's all of the elective work that has really struggled to get into hospital, and therefore they are the opportunities that are really being missed. The second half of this presentation is more about what's coming. So the other thing that happened recently is finally the GMC have given approval to the new curriculum. So the new curriculum, which when I talked to you was lots of ifs and buts, and this is what we think is going to happen, has now been published. And it's going to have an impact. The expectation is that it will still be rolled out in August as was planned. And we are beginning to need to think about how that will change. A little bit, everything's changed, but nothing's changed. The pilot is still ongoing for the run through. With now about 40% of posts in urology are part of the pilot. Although benchmarking at ST3 was scrapped as part of national selection this year and won't happen next year. And at any rate, it won't be part of the assessment. It'll only be part of the assessment of the pilot and not a part of the assessment of the trainee going forward. The curriculum, it's changed, and it's changed because people were aware that there was a common theme between the things that people ran into trouble for. When people began to look at what was missing from surgical training, not just in urology, but across the board, and indeed across the medical workforce, it became apparent that we are very keen to focus on technical skills and book knowledge and less on those generic skills that we all need to be effective doctors. And so it's that that the new curriculum is going to use to underpin how we work going forward. And one of the things that the curriculum contains is a number of descriptors about exactly what that means. But they're the same. They're the same whether you're doing trauma and orthopedics, ENT or urology, because the skills that you need are the same. The attitudes that you need are the same. For trainers, one of the problems has always been that there have been trainees who are technically competent, but you wouldn't let anywhere near your mother. And that's normally because of these soft skills. And this will allow people to be able to understand where they're deficient and to encourage people to improve in these areas, and therefore, hopefully, to improve as urologists. They're divided here down these 9 factors, which you will recognize from the GMC generic professional capabilities. And they're all based on one of these factors. And none of these things here could you possibly say was bad or not important as part of training. And each one then is broken down. You can see here professional skills include acting with honesty and integrity, or managing time and resources effectively. And that will become central to your role as a doctor and particularly as an NHS employee. And that is largely where we're training. So how's the curriculum broken down? Well, there's a job, isn't there? We all do versions of the same job. And the job is based on several things. There are clinics, there's inpatient work, there's theatre lists, there's emergency take, and there's working as a team. And those really are how it is divided up. The generic professional capabilities become the base, and each of these are divided as SIPs. And they are all then, all the SIPs in urology are shared with other surgical specialties. How you will demonstrate that you have that ability obviously is different in urology, but what you're being asked to demonstrate is the same whether you're a urologist or a vascular surgeon or a breast surgeon. And the capabilities in practice will each be assessed separately. And for urology, it's just these 5 things. Some other specialties have got extra specialties. And at the beginning, you will meet with your trainers and you will agree a supervision level for each of these SIPs, deciding where you're up to and where you want to get to over the period that you're in that placement. And partway through, you will assess where you've got to. Your assessors will assess and you will meet and then say, this is where I think I'm at. And they'll say, yeah, no, or actually, we think you're better than that. We hope we don't have to say, actually, we think that you're not quite there yet. But either way, you will then plan for the next 3 months of training with specific objectives to how you're going to meet those targets. And supervision level, it's slightly different to what we've had before. It's all about how much do I trust my trainee. And perhaps the most important thing is that being competent is not the top of the scale. Being competent is only level 4. So that it's possible to reward trainees who are more than competent, who are capable of training themselves and who have been able to show they are above and beyond. No one is expecting people necessarily to get to there, but the idea is that excellence will also be able to be recorded. And the other big thing that has been approved is the multi-consultant report. This always causes a little bit of discussion, but in truth, it's very much what happens behind the scenes in a good unit. But it's a formalized way of recording it. The important thing is not whether you can convince one particular trainer that you are capable, but it's that the team that you work with are happy that you have reached a certain level, and that becomes important. It looks like this, and in fact it is available on the ISCP website, and it's possible to practice. And for the trainers, I'm very keen that trainers do try and have a go at this before it gets introduced in August, so that everyone can try and work out what works and doesn't work for an individual. You'll see that when you press on a box, you'll get to one of those values. This one happens to be professional values and behaviors. And you have to say whether they're achieving that. If you've got no concerns, that's great. If there are concerns, they need to be recorded, and then you need to work out what you're going to do about it. And then here we've got to your supervision level. This will pop up as a box. You will then decide whether or not you're capable of doing this independently. And if you're not, then there will need to be an agreement about what you are going to do to improve that in the next period. Now, if you're an ST3, you will not be at for any of these things. Hopefully, by the time you reach ST6 and ST7, you will begin to be seen as competent in these things. And here we are, a number of things, and we'll say, well, these are good things. This is what you're doing that is positive, and people will be able to give you positive feedback. And this is the things that we need to work on over the next 3 to 6 months. And that becomes your report. And you will then get a summary report like that, and then that will be the basis for your training for the next period. Again, when you start a placement, the report from your last placement will be fed through. We've been very anxious in the past that people have arrived and there's been no proper formal handover. Trainees turn up in a new placement and they don't, the report from the last placement doesn't come with you. And that means that everyone spends some time working out exactly where you're up to. So the idea is that the placement will come, it will be discussed at the beginning. Clearly, if there are issues about that report, you will already know it because you know about that report before you move. There'll be a further discussion midway through the placement, which will just be about trying to identify feedback and improvement. And then the formal report will happen at the end of the placement and be taken on with you to your next placement. The idea is that it's outcomes-based, it'll be holistic, it follows the syllabus, it won't be based upon just one trainer who you fell out with because you wouldn't do his work in the private sector and he got pissed off. In fact, it will be the professional judgment of multiple trainers. It should both be formative at the beginning and summative, and you will get feedback on the way through, and it will be fed into the ARCP. The curriculum is divided into individual topics, and there are a number of critical conditions for which you will need to get CPDs and KEXs, and there'll be a few index procedures for which you will need PBAs to a certain level, level 4, by the time you get CCT. Critical conditions were defined by the GMC, and they can only be things where misdiagnosis would lead to devastating consequences. And in particular, they tend to be things that you would expect everybody to know and everyone to be able to deal with as an independent consultant. And they become part of the curriculum. And the GMC in particular is very keen to make sure that people are emergency safe when they get a CCT. These are the critical conditions for urology. And you can see, we'll come to the phasing in a minute, but you need to move out of phase 2 into phase 3, you need to be level 3 competent as a minimum. And to move into, to get a CCT, you'll need to be level 4 competent. And there are 1 or 2 things on there that will be different from the level that people have had up until now. So how will your ARCP work? So you'll have a learning agreement, you'll have work-based assessments, there'll probably be less of those. There's certainly no minimum number of work-based assessments that people need to have. It'll be decided as part of your your feedback from the beginning. There'll be self-assessment of your SIPs. There'll be assessment of where you're up to by your trainers, and that will feed back into your educational supervisor's report, and from there into your ARCP. So we talked just a little bit about phasing, and for urology, this is how it works. So phase 1, in effect, is basic surgical training, and that's really what we think of as core training at the moment, although for run-through trainings, that's ST1 and 2. Phase 2 is ST3 to 5, and at this point, training will be focused on the basic building blocks of urology, okay? But you will need to have index level 3 for all of those index procedures. And you will also need to have that before you can sit the exam. So if you haven't got this at the end of ST3, then you won't progress into ST6. So people will be held. So we don't get to that situation at the end where everybody, no one's happy to sign people off because they haven't got bits and pieces towards the end. The idea is to bring that further forward so that people concentrate and make that happen early. There are indicative procedures to go with these phases. There are lots of them. There'll be a lot less running around trying to catch numbers, but these are the competencies. You'll see there's no numbers associated with it. It is about proving that you're competent. Generally, we think that you would need 3 PBAs as a minimum for each of these things to show at this level. But it's not about numbers, it's about showing that you're competent, and ideally not 3 by 1 person, but 3 by a number of trainers. Again, it's not about just, people don't train anymore with one particular trainer. Most people train by teams, and you'll need to have a selection of people that show that you're competent. The last bit of training is associated with passing the exam. We all know that everyone spends 6 months doing very little other than thinking about the exam when the exam comes around. Trying to move from level 3 to level 4 in those procedures, any remedial work that's required, and with the hope that you would have 1 year to develop an area of special interest. And although that wouldn't be on your CCT, you would be able to say that you'd acquired those competencies. And I suspect people will ask for those competencies. These are the procedures that have been suggested would be the sort of thing and the competencies that will be required for the different special interest modules. And there will need to be some thinking about whether that can be arranged in region or whether there might be neighbouring regions that people need to get particular special interests. So in summary, there's a detailed syllabus for reference. The work-based assessments are about proving competency and not necessarily mapping to the whole syllabus. It's all about trying to make sure that we get competency as our main driver. We'll still see the use of work-based assessments for trainee learning. And if you're struggling in an area, then it's likely that people will ask for more work-based assessments in order to support improvement. We will also continue to have formal examinations. The mechanisms for teaching and learning will be similar, and the ARCP progression point will be similar. And we're not in many ways, we're training to exactly the same point, although we are looking for more emergency safe surgeons. This is what we hope will be the summary, that we are looking for high-level outcomes to reflect people capable of independent practice. We are trying to move towards professional judgment, and we're trying to demonstrate excellence. And we should have less ambiguity about what you need to achieve in order to have success. So this is what I'm asking. This is what people will need to do. There will be a new assessment method. It will begin to be rolled out at the first ARCP after August. So for many people towards the end of training, this won't affect them. This is where we're going to go. And we hope that ARCP 6 will actually occur when people are capable of being a day one consultant rather than at a specific time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil, for that. It was a really, really comprehensive view of the new curriculum, and you actually kept to time as well, which is very good.
Can always try.
Okay, so just I suppose we'll open up to some questions now. So just a question from me. I think that on the whole, the new curriculum, I think that the trainees are starting to come around to the idea of it, and I certainly think that it's much more based on competencies rather than numbers, which I think is very important. In terms of some of the assessments, the multi-consultant report, it does look like it's a little bit complex. Do you think that there's a risk of trainers not necessarily engaging with the new reports, which is slightly more complex than the old reports?
The problem with clinical supervisors' reports and educational supervisors' reports as they currently sit is that sometimes they're not incredibly well engaged documents, are they, if we're honest? So there is a real keenness to see whether or not we can do it. We hope that by having more than one person in the room and actually trying to make it slightly more formal, that those people who are enthusiastic will drag comments out of the rest and that the average level of report will improve for everybody. There is a bit of a gamble, but if you're going to get appropriate feedback, then you need better quality reports from the educational supervisor and from the clinical supervisor. And a little bit, I think that some of the trainers have worried about being exposed if they were to say something. And we want a considered opinion. We don't want an emotional response. So the idea of formalizing it, having a group together, talking it through, and then coming to a considered response ought to be fairer for everybody.
I mean, I think the idea of it overall is very good, but I do think there's certain challenges for not only the trainees in terms of the transition, but also the trainers as well. Josh, I'm just wondering what your comments. I mean, clearly you've been heavily involved in this across the different specialties. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the new curriculum, not only in urology, but in your own specialty, general surgery and otherwise.
I think broadly across all the trainee specialty associations, everyone's quite relieved, I think, to finally have the curriculum signed off. I know they took a long time for that to happen. And there was a couple of specialties who were really worried that there would be further changes because of coronavirus. Prof. Cornford, I'm slightly reticent to ask this question because I know how long they took to sign off the curriculum. But across a lot of the specialties where robotics is really commonplace now, there is some concern amongst sort of the current batch of trainees that we will become almost a bit of a lost tribe, a bit like there was for laparoscopic surgery. And I just wondered your thoughts on whether or not the curriculum goes far enough to expose trainees in urology to robotic surgery, and if not now, when?
So I think it has the potential to do it. We have written it fairly vague. I have to declare that I am a robot surgeon. So I have probably a vested interest in ensuring that robotic surgery is part of the curriculum. It isn't appropriate for everybody, at least not in urology it isn't. And so we hope that the final year that is your specialist interest, if you want to do robotic surgery, then you ought to be able to spend a year largely focused on doing that, as long as you have done the core urology before. And we are anxious that people have seen they're clearly going to do pelvic oncology, but they're running around trying to get one more perk and 2 more tapes, and it's not really appropriate. They're never going to do that sort of operating. So they should be able to have a year at the end where they could do it. Now, I think I'm not sure I could get you from nothing to doing robot prostatectomy independently in a year, but it'd be close. And I think we certainly have a program where you would get 60 to 80 robot prostatectomies in a year in our unit. And so you would have a pretty good idea by that point whether or not this was ever going to be something you could do. So I think you can. It's broad enough because it's not specific about robot, it's just about the procedure. And again, so a little bit, I don't think that there won't be robot procedures and there are procedures that will be performed using a robot, but the indications and what you're going to do is going to be exactly the same.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think the key thing that everyone agrees on in the new curriculum is that you focus on your subspecialty area and you focus on doing what you want to do, rather than box ticking for a subspecialty that you'll never do, which I think is probably one of the most important points. Okay.
I mean, you need to see some people. You still need to have a general background before you get going. You won't be able to avoid everything. You will need to have done something across the range of urology, partially so that you can pass the exam. You won't pass the exam without, but the idea is that it is just about competency rather than something else.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So I think if everyone's happy, unless there's any other further comments or questions, I think what we'd like to do now is move on to the second part of the session. So the good and bad of training, and this is where we'll be hearing the trainee presentations. So I think we'd like to move on to the first presentation. So just to clarify, we've got a 3-minute trainee presentation, and then we'll have 2 minutes for some questions from the panel, and then we'll move on to the next presentation shortly after that. So we'll be hearing from Khaled Hosni, first of all, from Royal Blackburn Hospital, and he'll be talking about Caesar challenges and the future workforce.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm just going to share my screen. So at the moment, I work as a consultant urological surgeon at James Cook University Hospital. I'm going at the moment through Caesar, just a few more bits to do and it should be signed off. So from my perspective as a non-trainee, I wanted to talk about Caesar challenges and how is that going to be effective in terms of the future workforce. Yeah. So the challenges of Caesar itself I tend to classify it into 3 different things. The first one of all is awareness of non-trainees of the pathway requirements and the fact that operating is not the most important thing, and there are other things including what's required to map the CCT requirements and also the GMC requirements. The other non-personal problems that non-trainees would face would include institution support from wherever they work, and also the lack of some subspecialties in certain hospitals where they get their first job, and whether they would rotate to different hospitals or change their jobs to map what's required for their Caesar. And obviously this could be hindered by personal and family issues, which we are all aware of, especially for people who comes from abroad to work in the UK. As for the CSER requirements, there are the GMC requirements, which includes variety of just paperwork, basically, and collecting evidence that of good medical practice, including appraisals, including some courses, just to show that you are a safe doctor, practicing in the UK. And there is the GCST requirements with the curriculum that Professor Cornford has just talked about in a minute, in the last few minutes. The new curriculum has come out, and having done my CSER on the old curriculum, I'm not quite sure how much is that going to affect CSER for people who are going to apply in the future. For me, the time frame, because I started from when I got my first job here in the UK, it took me about 5 to 6 years to collect the evidence and do everything properly as all my trainee colleagues. Maybe with a new curriculum, it might be shorter, it might be longer. I can't say for sure for now. As for the workforce challenges, I've had a look on the BAUS workforce report from 2016. That's the last thing I could see, and I can see that the number of unfilled post expectations over the next 10 to 12 years, or let's say over the next 7 years, are expected to be between 200 odd to 700 odd. It depends on how much trainees are coming out of the training ladder, are included in this, a number of consultants' retirements, and expansion in units. The BAUS workforce report stated that the expansion in the last 15 years was almost 4.7% expansion, and that takes us to 788 unfilled posts by the end of 2026. How is that going to affect CSER? That's another issue. So I came up with a few ideas which may help to cover the gap from people who are like me, coming from CSER pathway. And in my unit, there are at least 5 or 6 CSER champions. I would suggest the following. We need to have a representation of non-trainees in the BsOT, which may be useful to get non-trainees involved in what are the training requirements, and this will help them to identify what gaps do they have, and that sort of makes them at the very far end of being able to achieve CSER. And I guess this is very important to have that sort of balance, or that sort of blending of culture between trainees and non-trainees. Maybe one of the consultants, one of the CSER champions, could be a CSER lead through BAUS. One of the other things, as when I used to be in Blackburn, I used to be the SAS lead for Blackburn, and I used to attend some Northwest Health Education of Northwest SAS meetings. And one of the ideas that we sort of discussed across all specialties to have regional posts, so people could rotate between different in the same specialty in many different posts in the same region. Maybe it's a regional, it could be a regional agreement. We could come up with what's called a CSER SAS doctor, for example. And that model is done actually in A&E and also in ophthalmology. I can sort of state that A&E or ED doctors have that model in MRI. And I'm aware that Southampton are doing the same CSER training for 5 years for ophthalmology. The last thing I can come up with to sort of cover the gap is to negotiate for the established local consultants at the moment, to negotiate with GMC and GCST whether if we can go from old requirements for CSER for the old curriculum, to see whether if we can cover the gap with getting substantive posts for the local consultants who are actually has been in service for a number of years now. Obviously, those who are struggling to get CSER themselves. Thank you very much. I tried to just hurry up while presenting to have some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, Carla. Thank you very much. A little bit over time there, but it's okay. Okay, so thanks very much. I mean, this is something that we've discussed as BsOT previously, because I think that this cohort of doctors in urology are hugely overlooked. And I think that it's a cohort that's underrepresented, particularly from a training perspective. Phil, I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that.
So BAUS has said that it would have on BAUS Council that there would be for non-career grade support on BAUS Council. And I think that that is a really important step in recognising this group. The question a little bit with training and for the non-career grades is, so if there is a separate way of training that is approved, that is different from the national selection, then we would need to be clear that it's equivalent. And at the moment, that is the case. So at the moment in law, it is written into the GMC statute that it must be equivalent to a CCT. And so anything that would allow that would need a change in legislation, which is why you have to reach the standard of the urology curriculum at the time you apply. So that's how it works, and that would need a change in legislation to change that.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Khaled. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on to the next talk now. So the next talk is going to be from Zoe Panayai, and we'll be hearing about intraoperative complication complicated by difficult senior support. So Zoe, I'll hand over to you. It sounds quite interesting.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just share my screen. Hi there, thanks for having me. So my name is Zoe, currently in ST4 at Blackburn Hospital. Now this is a discussion about an intraoperative complication I was a part of and the various factors that contributed to this, and my reflection on how these experiences can shape our training as trainees. So just briefly detailing a background to the situation. So I was a core trainee acting up as a registrar on call, working in a different hospital. I was called to an iatrogenic bladder injury out of hours. At the time, of course, I called the consultant on call in, who was a brand new locum I'd not worked with before either. Now, although I was relatively junior at the time, of course, it was evident that the consultant was struggling technically and obviously was in a completely new environment. It was also apparent that there was a bit of a breakdown in communication between the consultant and the theatre staff. Additional factors included the fact there was a language barrier and there was an extra pressure of another emergency off-site that some of the theatre staff that had stayed behind for this case were required for. So as a junior trainee, I was struggling to help technically with the case. I did suggest to call another consultant in, despite the fact that it was out of hours, and unfortunately this was declined on numerous occasions. So obviously there's a number of situations and number of problems identified in this case. Of course, primarily a patient safety issue, not just for the patient on the table, but the potential other patient that was requiring emergency surgery. There was a trainee acting up, a consultant out of their depth, working in a new environment, obviously a new staff member. And this was exacerbated by the fact there was a delay in escalation. So the outcome of this, eventually another consultant was notified who attended out of hours, and the patient didn't go to any harm, and later this was raised as a serious untoward incident at the trust. So what learning points can I discuss about this? So other than, of course, reflecting on the surgical details of the case, for me, it was apparent that the overriding issues here were non-technical. There was an unfamiliar team, resulting in a communication breakdown, lack of situational awareness, which is obviously a buzzword that we often see in human factors courses, and a delayed escalation of the case from all members involved. And of course, the secondary issue to raise here is that there was a trainee acting up in this situation, which I suppose is probably less of an issue as registrars, but of course there's a huge range in our competencies from ST3 to ST7 in dealing with urology emergencies. So what are my take-home messages from this case? So I think as trainees, we shouldn't oversee the importance of learning the non-technical skills of managing complications, and not just focusing on the surgery side. Also, for me, it reinforced the requirement of these human factors courses and the sessions that we're advised to attend as trainees. You know, sometimes we feel that they're less of an importance than surgical courses, but I do see the benefit to these. And linking into what Professor Cornford has mentioned, the importance of some of these skills are represented by the new ISCP curriculum and the generic capabilities in practice. And whether or not we should consider more intraoperative focused human factors courses in the future, obviously COVID pending. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went over time.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I mean, that certainly is quite a difficult scenario. Is this sort of scenario of going into another operating theatre, almost kind of operating behind enemy lines, it's keeping me up at night at the moment as I'm just edging towards CCT. It's the sort of thing that Professor Cornford wouldn't even bat an eyelid at, I imagine. Now, just a question from me. I mean, obviously it's very difficult, isn't it, to have to raise concerns with a consultant about their own operative ability. I mean, how did you find that scenario? Did you leave it some time before mentioning anything, or could you tell quite quickly that this wasn't really going the right direction?
Yeah, I did raise things at the time, and then kind of on the side to the anaesthetist, who I think that eventually led to another consultant being called from the consultant anaesthetist viewpoint. But it was just a very difficult situation, and obviously the consultant involved was in a new place, and there were all the other issues I mentioned. So,
and out of interest, who was it who actually called the other substantive consultant in? Was it one of the scrub? Was it the anaesthetist? Was it who actually made the call?
It was, I think, it was the anaesthetist that asked one of the scrub staff to de-scrub and call the consultant. The other consultant, I think, but it was a while ago, so I don't remember the details that well. But
Phil, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this situation. I'm sure you've been the person called in to this sort of scenario before.
I mean, I think it's always very tricky. One of the things we don't talk about a lot is what happens after you get your CCT and how you get integrated into consultant practice. So many years ago, when registrars waited a long time as a senior registrar, in effect acting as a consultant in all but name, then people, as they eventually got independent practice, had got all of the practical experience that they required to deal with most of the complications. But people are being appointed younger and younger, and as a consequence, they often need some form of support and mentoring. It's more difficult if you're a locum, but in a good team, someone would say, look, you're on this week. If there is a problem, let me know. It's normally fairly informal, but you would hope that that would happen. People aren't always happy to call in another consultant. Sometimes it feels as though there is a loss of faith, and that's dangerous. And we need to get over ourselves, really, and stop believing that we are God, and instead understand that we will need support as we move through, and we'd be much better to initiate that, ask for support ourselves. That'll be taken much better than having the anaesthetist phone up the substantive consultant and them asking. At that point, you've lost much more faith and you're completely out of control, and there's likely to be a bit of a chat in the boss's office at some point in the next few days as you stress over what's gone on. So.
And I think that's the key point, isn't it, Phil? You know, me being in this situation at the moment, I think that when you are getting towards the end of CCT and when you are peri-CCT, I think you'll be very aware of what your limitations are and what your strengths are. And I think that at any consultant interview, they will push you on what your limitations are. And I think it's important that you are honest and that you do seek help appropriately when necessary. So that's going for any senior trainees out there who are doing a bit of soul searching at the moment. Okay, so for the next talk, we'll be hearing from Miss Gemma Scrimger from Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust, and we'll be hearing about challenges during training at the tip of the iceberg. So I'll hand over to you, Gemma.
Thank you. So can everybody see my slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. The kind of point behind this talk started 3 years ago. I was in F2. I was on a late shift when my dad phoned me while I was at work, and he said, I'm sorry to do this, I'm sorry to call you at work, but your mum and I just can't do this anymore. And you can probably imagine that divorce is generally not preceded by happiness and stability. And in my family, it was largely my mother's problems with alcohol that led to the end. 2 weeks later, unfortunately, my cousin committed suicide, and that was shortly followed by the death of my very heartbroken granddad who'd raised him. Soon after that, I lost my ability to run, which was my big coping mechanism after a pretty bad knee injury, which required a few surgeries to fix. And I then moved to a city where I had a very limited support network, and it sort of went on, and it kind of felt life was a bit like this. I was quite amused to find that there was one with this particular title. So about 2 years ago, I found myself in a GP surgery, just literally breaking down and asking for help. A couple of months before that, though, I passed my Part A exam, and soon after that, I would thankfully successfully apply for core training. So I think because things sort of looked okay, no one really asked if I was okay. And, you know, depression is an isolating experience. And although I knew I couldn't possibly be alone in what I was going through, that's exactly how I felt. And it probably took me longer than it needed to get to this really critical point of asking for help. And we know that surgeons are underrepresented in the group of healthcare professionals who do seek help for mental illness. There's data from the Practitioner Health Programme in London in 2014 that showed that over 1,000 service users, only 44, which was 4.3% of surgeons, despite the fact that they made up 11% of GMC register. I think this is multifactorial, obviously, but I think it's partly related to how we talk about resilience in surgical training. I think the problem is this. I think resilience is important because it allows us to deal with all of this, all this day-to-day stuff that we all go through, particularly at work, and there's obviously many more examples. But I think when you start to struggle, you question your own resilience and you worry that if you declare yourself, others are going to do the same thing. But actually looking back, I think what's happening on below the surface doesn't, if you're struggling to cope because of that, that's got nothing to do with the lack of resilience. And I think that's really important. So my experiences have led me to believe that we need to do better to support ourselves and our trainees. I think how we get there has to be a very open conversation, and I hope by talking today I've made a small contribution towards that. I think there are some really promising signs. There's loads of examples, I think, but there's now an RCS annual wellbeing event. There are guidelines being produced for surgeons involved in the aftermath of adverse events. This talk is another really good example. And in London, we recently set up a welfare programme for core trainees. I'd really love for urology to sort of lead the example on this. Orthopedics, as another example, have done a really good job with their Hammer It Out anti-bullying campaign. So to conclude, the challenges that we all seem to be facing really are often just the tip of the iceberg. I know that this is a simple point, but I think it's a really important one. So I just want to say, please be mindful of this in your interactions with your colleagues. Don't underestimate the importance of checking in with each other, or even just some kind words, because you never know, you might just be helping somebody stay afloat, somebody like me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Gemma. I mean, that really was a series of unfortunate events, and you know, you've done very well to come through that. So thank you for sharing us that with us. I think on the whole, as surgeons, the "feel free to cope" mantra is often taunted around as surgeons, and I think that actually it's okay not to be okay in these sort of situations. And I think that you know, we do need to support each other, and I think it's very good that you've got a platform here to discuss these sort of things. And I'm hoping that by discussing these sort of things and coming forward with these sort of things, it can help support others. Josh, I just wonder if you've got any comments on that at all.
Yeah, Gemma, thanks so much for that talk. I think it's always a real show of character when people are willing to open up and discuss things which they found difficult. Because often, particularly when I've been in this situation, the biggest help is when you speak to people that have been through something like that before. And I guess my question to you is one out of interest, really. You know, how did you climb yourself out of it, or how are you still climbing yourself out of it? Where did you turn to? Who did you go to? What things did you do?
To be honest, it was, and actually in the lead up to this talk, it's kind of inevitably brought some of it back, as I've been thinking, how am I going to get this across? How am I going to say this sort of articulately? One of the registrars was asking me the other day, how actually did you get through it? And the honest answer is, I don't really know. I was fortunate in that I saw a wonderful GP who, you know, just kind of stopped me trying to say, I know I shouldn't have to ask for help, but I am, blah, 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 and just said, stop, you know, it's okay. There are reasons that you've got to this point and, you know, you're in the right place. I tried to sort of focus on other exercise, things like that, because the rehab for my knee was ongoing, it was really important. I think I've always been quite good at looking at the long-term gratification, so working towards, you know, getting into core training and then in the longer view towards urology has helped because it's given me something to focus on. But it was the hardest time I've gone through by far, and it was just over such a sustained period. You know, I was treated for depression. I was on antidepressants for about a year, and you know, thankfully things seem to be leveling out. But I mean, I think this is only more important in the current climate with COVID, because you know, the WHO are predicting that this is going to be, that we're on the precipice of a huge mental health crisis. So, and we're not going to be sort of exempt from that in healthcare, in medicine, and surgery.
Sure. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great, Gemma. Thank you for sharing. Do we have any other comments, or shall we move on to the next talk? Okay, so we've got our final talk now. So we'll be hearing from Katie Eyre from Royal Berkshire Hospital, and she's going to be telling us about returning to urology training after maternity leave and training less than full time. So Katie, I'll hand over to you now.
Super, thank you for the introduction. Okay, is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah, super. So hello, I'm partway through my registrar training, and I think my challenges in training have come from my desire to be both a mother as well as a surgeon, and to try to do both really well. In 2017, there was a Channel 4 documentary, which some of you may remember, which asked, do women have a place in modern medicine? It may seem provocative as a title, but I think there are real barriers to whether women, often those with children, can succeed as surgeons. However, 25% of urology trainees are female, so the two must be compatible. I've returned to training 3 times following maternity leave, and I was the first less than full-time urology trainee in my deanery. I've experienced a range of challenges, regaining surgical skills, often whilst trying to meet unrealistic expectations, building my confidence in a pressurized environment where there's often been a lack of recognition of my time away from training and that I might need adjusted supervision or extra support. Opportunities have sometimes been preferentially available to full-time trainees, and expectations from supervisors have not been adjusted to match the fact that I am not at work every day. Professional relationships with full-time colleagues and supervisors have not always been straightforward, when my working less than full-time has been conflated either with a lack of ambition or a lack of commitment. I've struggled with identifying a role model in someone who has lived my experiences and achieved what I'm aiming for. I think senior colleagues in this position can be invaluable for motivation and for inspiration. In addition to all these things, all 3 trusts I've worked at have struggled to determine my less than full-time pay appropriately. However, since my first period out of training in 2013, the landscape around return to training has changed dramatically, and for the better, through the introduction of the supported return to training programme. I've been involved in delivering this national programme locally, where we aim to equip and prepare surgical trainees returning to work, and to provide support for those wishing to work less than full-time for the first time. So trainees and supervisors can now access extensive evidence-based resources through the support programme to identify the challenges facing trainees on returning to urology, and they can develop individualised plans to support their needs. In our region where I work, we have nominated contacts with in-depth knowledge of different specialties to help with this process. Peer support through the programme can build confidence and inspiration for those embarking on working less than full-time for the first time. I strongly believe that women with children, and any surgeon who chooses to work less than full-time brings positive diversity to our workforce. This support programme improves the well-being of trainees at a really difficult time of transition, helping them to be more motivated and productive so they can reach their full potential as surgeons. I would encourage any trainees returning to training and supervisors in contact with these trainees to access these resources and to seek the peer support available. So in answer to my question, can you be a surgeon and a mother? Yes, you can. And you can do it well, particularly now that there is a little support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that. So interestingly there, you said that you'd struggled to find a role model who had been through a similar scenario as you have done. In that case, do you have any advice to female trainees who are less than full-time, or have been on maternity leave, to try and ease the burden, essentially, of less than full-time training?
I think my main thing that I've learned over the 7 years that I've worked less than full-time is that it is possible, and lots of people have said over the years, especially when I rotate to a new hospital, it's not possible. It's, you know, what are you going to do in X scenario or this scenario? And then by the end of the year at that placement, I've had comments along the lines of, oh, are you less than full-time? Or, you know, other similar sort of supportive comments that essentially meant that actually often people really didn't notice and that it was highly achievable. And I think to find somebody who has done it or is doing it is really, really helpful. And certainly 5 or 6 years ago, I looked around me and I couldn't find anybody, you know, to speak to or to encourage me who'd been in that situation. Whereas many of my male registrar colleagues had, in the men around them, people who they were similar to, or who could look to for advice. But I think that's changing because more people are less than full-time, more people have done it, more people are trying to do it. But I think my main message would be that it is possible and it does work and it can be successful.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any other comments from anyone on the panel?
If you could have supervisors up and down the country understand one thing that less than full-time trainees go through, and you think that that would be the thing that would change how you are treated the most, what would it be?
That's quite difficult. I think I would, from the support program, so from the returner's point of view, rather than the less than full-time point of view, I think it is grasping an understanding of what those first 6 weeks are like, and that actually you can make a really big difference to people's ongoing confidence by how they are treated and managed and supported in those first 6 weeks from returning to training, whether they're less than full-time or not less than full-time. And they may have been on maternity leave or academic, but those first 6 weeks I think are so vital because it's such a difficult transition time, and providing somebody, you know, in the way that Gemma was saying, somebody who says, are you okay? Are things going okay? You know, what do you think would help? Okay, things are not quite right. What would help? What could we change in the next couple of weeks? And having a plan to get through those first, I think, difficult 6 weeks. And in terms of less than full-time, I think I would say that people grasping that less than full-time means less than full-time. So again, changing recently, somebody said to me, oh, well, you're going to miss out on training opportunities. Well, I know that. That's why I'm less than full-time. That's the definition of working less than full-time. Don't say that to me. And just grasping that that's what it means. I will be here for 3 days or 4 days, and I will make the absolute most of those 4 days. But there is no point in saying you're going to miss opportunities. I know that. That's why my training is going to take me a decade. So I think those two things really are the main thing that I would say to people.
Okay, Phil.
Thank you.
So I think one of the most important things that you said is that we need to open up less than full time for more reasons. So I think that if the only people that do less than full time are female and are pregnant, then it will always seem like a subset. Whereas if less than full time is available to everybody, without real reason for explaining why you need to go less than full time, it's just a choice, then the system will find that men and women both go less than full time because there are other things in life. And I think for a generation of people who come through and not going to spend every hour that God sends at work, it might actually allow us to include a greater range of individuals and make urology and surgery beyond urology a more interesting place to work and a more balanced place to work if we encourage people not just for there's only one reason you go less than full time. It needs to be much bigger than that.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Clark and I'm a Urology ST5 in the Northwest, and today I'm going to speak to you about a project we did to look at whether introducing a nurse surgical first assistant to robotic theatres affected training opportunities for urology trainees. So to operate using the robot requires a surgeon at the console and a second surgeon or specially trained assistant at the bedside. And assisting is a very valuable experience for trainees in terms of learning operative steps, laparoscopic skills, and also troubleshooting and problem solving of the technology itself. Trainees, however, move around frequently and are often pulled between different lists due to different training or service provision needs. Robotic teams, however, work best when you have a very consistent team, and so a nurse surgical first assistant was introduced to try and improve consistency within the robotic team. So that's just a picture showing the layout in a robotic case. So we were interested to know whether introduction of the nurse SFA had an impact on training opportunities. Did it provide more opportunities to train at the console, more opportunities to attend other lists, or in fact less opportunity to assist at the bedside? So to investigate this, we collected data on the number and type of operations logged by trainees over the 8 weeks before introduction of the nurse SFA and 8 weeks after introduction of the nurse SFA to robotic theatres. We included 7 trainees in this, 2 core trainees, 2 specialist trainees, and 3 clinical fellows. And data was collected from printouts of logbooks and also robotic case operating notes. So before introduction of the nurse SFA, trainees logged 238 operations, 24 of which were assisting the robot. And in that 8-week period, no trainee received any console training. In the 8 weeks following introduction of the SFA, trainees logged 208 operations, 32 of which were robotic. 19 of these were assisted by trainees and 13 were assisted by the nurse SFA. We found 5 they were assisted by the nurse SFA and 1 they were assisted by another trainee. So that's a 38% console training rate with the nurse SFA present compared to 19% without. So in summary, introduction of nurse surgical first assistant to robotic theatres increased training opportunities for trainees to gain console experience. Interestingly, it did not seem to affect overall operative numbers for trainees. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alice Hartley and I'm an ST6. And this talk highlights how trainers and trainees work together collaboratively in a single unit to improve the training there. So as a bit of background and to describe the problem, the department that we're talking about is a busy unit that covered a catchment of about 900,000 patients in a hub and spoke model. So there was elective activity on the spoke sites, but major surgery and on-call operated from the main centre. There was a 1 in 8 on-call, and that consisted of 5 trainees, 1 research fellow and 2 staff grades. And it was a 24-hour on-call with 48-hour weekend. All trainees did clinics on the spoke sites, normally about 3 clinics a week plus a flexi list. And trainees weren't infrequently pulled from theatre to cover extra clinics. Post-on-call days, half days after the 24-hour shift were rarely taken due to having to cover these clinics, and their balance therefore shifted heavily towards service provision. This led to low morale and led to being quite an unpopular unit. So what do we try and do? Well, the trainees collectively approached the clinical director and discussions were made with solutions rather than just complain about the problem. So the rota was redesigned to save up all the post-24 on-call half days. So instead of having a half day, you had a whole week off after a weekend on call. And if the trainees then wanted to come in for their elective theatre list during that time, they were welcomed. But it meant that the scheduling of the clinics was easier and cancelling them actually happened, so people weren't pulled to cover. Trainees no longer went to the spoke sites for clinics, and so this work was redistributed to the staff grades. So instead of people travelling to and from the base site to clinics, you had staff grades based at the spoke sites for chunks of the week, and consultants also picked up some of this extra work. A new lead for education was appointed in the department, and he liaised between management and the trainees, and that provided a really good source of support and advice for trainees. And as a result, morale significantly improved, and this unit now provides excellent training and is one of the most popular units in the region. So in terms of learning points, the real thing here was the collaboration between the trainers and the trainees, and it was a really successful venture because of this. It gave trainees some real autonomy over creating the job plan, and it also gave us a really good insight into the financial aspects of planning and balancing service provision and training. And we felt this was a really important learning experience for when we become future consultants. Thanks very much.
So, less than full-time training is undertaken by a minority of urology trainees, but nonetheless, many of you will know that there are 3 ways of undertaking less than full-time training. One is as an LTFT trainee in a full-time slot, which leaves some days and on-calls uncovered. One is in a slot share where 2 less than full-time trainees share a slot and share the on-calls. And finally, there's supernumerary, where a department has an additional trainee who usually doesn't do any on-calls. Slot shares are preferred by many and for several good reasons. One is that they cover the department's needs. Another is that it makes fiscal sense from a HEE point of view. As a trainee, it can be good to have a less than full-time ally, and it helps with the feelings of guilt, dread, and anguish which accompany the days that we don't work at hospital. But with relatively few LTFT trainees in urology, it can be difficult to balance the needs of both trainees at rotation times. The drivers to maintain slot shares can override attention to an individual trainee's needs. We all know that different types of centres suit trainees at different levels of training. And this abstract was written following conversations with colleagues from around the country who had nearly come unstuck due to going to inappropriate centres for their particular level of training. It would seem that once in a slot share, little consideration is given to whether the slot share should be continued or changed. Now, of course, training programmes can be challenging to manage, and placement of all trainees in perfect centres can't always happen. But it would appear that slot share trainees experience imperfect centre placement far more frequently. Usually, it would appear that the needs of the more senior trainee are preferenced when placing the pair. And that seems like a reasonable approach, but there have been reports of adverse ARCP outcomes because of this. For example, one trainee received an outcome 2 after being placed in a tertiary centre for part of their ST3. And in this centre, they performed more robotic surgery than any transurethral resections or inguinal-scrotal work. So although slot shares have many benefits, the less than full-time trainees that I've discussed this with would like an annual review of whether their slot share remains appropriate for each level of training. In order to ensure the best training for the best number of trainees possible, this needs to be part of the placement calculations and discussions for TPDs and their supporting teams. Thank you. Hello, my name is Lizzie Chandra and I'm an ST5 in urology, and I have had the audacity to utilise my uterus twice. I wear scrubs, those big blue baggy pyjamas, provocatively, and I really should have considered the impact on the specialty of my onerous extra work commitments, also known as children, before deciding to pursue surgery. The colleagues who have written this abstract with me are Candice, Rahana, Marina and Alice. Between them, one wears dresses with zips in, which is apparently an invitation for a colleague to want to undress her. One has breasts that are distracting during a case where she is fully scrubbed. One is completely unreasonable for not wanting to come in and leave her preschool child with the secretary while she does the list for her boss on her non-working day. And one is unable to be a proper surgeon unless they grow a bit taller. Now, this would not be the way we would choose to introduce ourselves, but they are real comments that we have received over the years. What is interesting has been our repeated response to these episodes, where we have buttoned our lips, walked away, changed the subject, or even, at times, laughed. We've gone about our day feeling like we've shaken off the comment and told ourselves it wasn't really a big deal. But the truth always outs at Supper Club. Supper Club is our nickname for a social get-together, but aside from us being good friends, this opportunity offers real and structured peer support. When the aforementioned and some of the more subtle encounters we have had are discussed, it is then that we have at times realised the degree of the inappropriateness of that encounter. We are not stupid women, so why is it that we don't always recognise these encounters for what they are: bullying, undermining and harassment? The culture we work in is rife with banter. This group agrees that this is actually one of the things that attracts us to surgery. We love banter like the rest, but when does banter become bullying, or worse, harassment? And when does our innate characteristics lead us to be undermined? From our experience of working with assertive, bright people of all genders, colours and social class and grades and roles, at work, we have observed that when you experience these behaviours, you are in no position to call it out, and the data supports our observations as true. That's why we all need to step up and support our colleagues. Not doing so has a high cost, because those experiencing these behaviours are so affected that their cognitive ability is temporarily decreased. They literally can't think straight. Their bandwidth is reduced and they might make errors. Additionally, they will be less productive, less likely to stay late, and less likely to help cover that vacant on call. But worse than that, bystanders or observers are also affected in the same way, but to a slightly lesser degree. And you can bet your bottom dollar that this stuff spreads like an infectious disease, affecting everyone it touches. And this is serious stuff, because I think it's quite obvious that all those things detrimentally affect patient care and safety at work. So, next time you see a colleague experience any uncivil behaviour, why don't you call it out? Make it clear that it's not okay, because the person on the receiving end isn't able to do it at that time, but they are, for sure, more likely to pay that kindness forward at a later date, slowly and surely improving the culture of our workplaces, which in turn improves patient care, improves the quality of training, and improves all of our working lives. Good morning, and in this presentation today, I would like to spend 3 minutes explaining why less than full-time trainees are superheroes who, in my experience at least, don't wear their pants on the outside. Less than full-time training offers the opportunity to be able to train alongside other commitments. Without this option for training, there are certainly some excellent colleagues who would not stand amongst our ranks. Having people working in this way in our specialty is of huge benefit to us. And that's all of us, not just those who attract the less than full-time training label. A greater variety of people with beautiful differences working in a greater number of different ways is actually good for a service. Studies show that it creates more resilience, improves working environments, increases workforce retention, improves quality, and improves productivity. Those who are happy with their work-life balance work harder whilst they are at work. Now, I had always thought this to be true, and so I decided to test out the theory. My first go at this was to look at how much direct clinical care less than full-time trainees offered compared to their full-time colleagues. Turns out that if you look at the percentage of time at work, they do more. So if we call a full-time week 10 sessions, I worked out what full-time and less than full-time trainees were doing per 10 sessions of work. This data is from 3 units in the Yorkshire region over a 2-year period. It represents 5 less than full-time trainees and 16 full-time trainees from 2 teaching hospitals and 1 DGH. As you can see, proportionally, the less than full-time trainees do more direct clinical care, with a significant reduction in access to education, less time to do admin, and far few half days following their on-calls. Within the clinical work, they do a bit more clinic, but it's not significantly different to their full-time colleagues. But they do a lot more flexi sessions, and that was significantly different to their full-time colleagues and was across all 3 sites. What is it about less than full-time trainees and flexi, I wonder? It's possible that we can't draw strong conclusions from a study of 3 centres in 1 region with a total of 21 trainees, but it is a snapshot, and from the conversations I've had with colleagues from around the country, I think it is representative. Now, in my time as a less than full-time trainee, I have received, overheard and observed a variety of comments and attitudes to less than full-time training. And unfortunately, there have certainly been times and places where the balance of good and bad hasn't really felt favourable. ASIT has done some great work looking at the attitudes that less than full-time trainees experience, and their assessment wasn't too positive either. Clearly, for our wonderful specialty to thrive in a changing world, we need to embrace different ways of working and change cultures and attitudes. Today, in 3 minutes, I can only present an eggs all in one basket argument based on this data, but I think it does show that less than full-time trainees are dedicated, committed, skilled, able, and often brilliant colleagues. They are doing their bit and more. And we need to start recognising this, celebrating their presence in our workplaces and recognising them for the superheroes that they are. So that, in summary, is why, until the day I die, I will wave the flag for less than full-time training. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much to the panel for all of your involvement and all of your comments, and thank you very much to all of the speakers as well who have delivered some excellent talks this evening. So as one of my final acts as BsOT chair, I'll be handing over to Neil Harvey, who's taken the baton from now. And I think you just wanted to say a couple of words just before we draw the session to a close. Is that right, Neil?
Yes, thank you, SOT. I don't think I can really describe the year we've had better than you already have. So I don't need any slides. I think that it goes without saying that we're very grateful to everyone at BsOT for everything that they've done. And it really is a case of what we can see ahead of us. And I think it's fair to say that we're going to have a hard winter, both for us as individuals, in terms of coming together, the effects that the winter ahead is going to have on us, and also on training. But we can look forward to working with our colleagues here at ASIT, TUF, Urolink, and with Students for Urology to try and improve urological training at every level. And that's really what I'm hoping for over the coming year. As part of that, I hope maybe when we see some light at the end of the tunnel, people might start getting to go back to fellowships. And I think it's promising that we have now 2 fellowship directors appointed at BsOT, and I'd be very keen to work with them to get trainees leaving programs and into fellowships again. Really then, all that's left for me to say is thank you to SOT. And I wish I had a nice picture of him, but the only one that's of any good size, I'm sure he wouldn't be happy for me to show, because it's from his fun run for TUF. And needless to say, he wasn't looking his best at the end of that. I would appreciate it if he could look outside his office door and see if there's anything there. SOT.
Say that again, Neil. Sorry, it just cut out for a second there.
Can you look outside your office door?
What is going on here?
so I had high hopes that you would be able to receive this in person, but obviously that hasn't been possible. But I do know where you live in a very non-threatening way. So from everyone here at BsOT, for everything that you've done for trainees over the past year, and all the hardships that you've really helped everyone get through in terms of supporting the CSTs and all the trainees, both in terms of exams and then trying to CT. I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Neil. That was a very elaborate way to deliver a gift, getting my wife involved. But yeah, thank you very much. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, guys. I really appreciate that. So I think that draws this session to a close. So thank you very much for joining us. We have one more session, which we'll be having a bit later on in the week, and hopefully you can join us for that as well. So thank you very much.